President, that will be on the foundation that we will repeal Obamacare, and under the signature of the next President of the United States. I see that the Speaker of the House has arrived on the floor, and I'd be happy to yield to whatever cause that might be.
Let me thank my colleague for yielding. You know, Mr. Speaker, there's a huge gulf between Washington, D.C. and the American people. You know, they're dealing with tough times. They're struggling to pay their bills. And they look to Washington, they see politicians who can't stop spending money, their money. Listen, we're broke. And we need to stop the out-of-control spending spree that's going on in Washington, D.C. The House has acted. We passed a bill that raised the debt limit, cuts spending, puts real reforms in place, and requires the Congress to send to the states a balanced budget amendment. It's called Cut, Cap, and Balance. We've done our job. The Democrats who run Washington have done nothing. They can't stop spending the American people's money. They won't, and they have refused. The Senate Majority Leader says that they won't offer a plan to cut spending or a plan to raise the debt limit. Frankly, that's irresponsible. Mr. Speaker, where's their plan? President Obama talks about being the adult in the room. Where's his plan to cut spending and to raise the debt limit? Listen, we're in the fourth quarter here. We're fighting for jobs. We're fighting for the country's future, and we're fighting for the American people. I yield back.
In reclaiming my time, may I inquire as to how much time I have remaining?
The gentleman has approximately 12 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm very happy that the Speaker arrived on the floor to make that point here. The point is this, that we passed Cut, Cap, and Balance. And we've done our job. Now the challenge is for the United States Senate and the President of the United States to do their job. I would prefer they just accept the model that's been messaged down that hallway over to the Senate, and I'd prefer that the President would endorse that and step up in the next few minutes and say, let's get this done. This can be done in a very short period of time. All we have to do is agree. And instead, the President and the Democrats in the majority and the Senate seem to want to insist upon tax increases have to be part of any package that might come through. Well, this goose that lays the golden egg is the free enterprise private sector goose. This goose has to live off of some profits, and they have to have profit in order for there to be jobs. I would add to the Speaker's statement a question about, it's been about jobs. We've done our job, and this is about jobs, but I think that we fail to remind the American people that jobs have to, the wages are what pay for jobs. Nobody's going to go say, I've got a job, but it doesn't pay. The money's got to come from somewhere. Where does it come from? That needs to be stated and restated, that the money for wages that pay for jobs has to come out of profit. Nobody can operate at a loss, so companies have to make some money. If they don't have the opportunity to do so because of the burden of taxes, or because of the burden of regulation, or the burden of the indecision in not knowing what the government's going to do next, which keeps a lot of that capital on the sidelines, they're not going to expand, they're not going to do new hires. In fact, they're not going to provide wages and benefit packages of increases unless they have profits. So I'm one of those people that think, I want businesses to make money. I want them to make money, and I want them to expand the jobs, and I want them to invest that money with confidence they can make more. And if it goes to their head too far and they become too vertically integrated or too monopolistic, then it's up to the entrepreneurs out there to take a look and say, I think I can gather the capital together and compete against them and provide a good or a service that has a better value and make money doing it, and in doing so, that profit turns into jobs. I am one who has met payroll for over 1,440 consecutive weeks. I made it every week on time. There were times that We didn't do very well in our household because I paid me last. I paid the employees first because they are the front line troops. I paid the interest at the bank second because I had to have the capital to operate. You set those priorities when you go through those things, but jobs come from profit. And let's have a scenario that allows businesses to invest and have confidence in the future. And cut, cap, and balance does lay out the right scenario. I know that Speaker Boehner has been concerned about hitting this August 2nd deadline that I think is not as hard a deadline as Tim Geithner believes it is. I think the Secretary of the Treasury is carrying water for the President of the United States and putting statements out there. I think the President of the United States is willfully scaring seniors. I think he's doing so when he says that he can't guarantee that military pensions or Social Security would be paid on time. Mr. Speaker, yes, they can. The only person on the planet that can guarantee they be paid on time is the President of the United States. So you couldn't be any more wrong than when he says he can't guarantee it. Yes, he can. Does he know this truth? Can he not understand his job? He seems to assert his power where it doesn't exist. Doesn't he know that he can exert his power where it does exist? I'll just tell this anecdote that was part of a political commercial, and I'll let people draw their own conclusions on this. But back in 1996, when Bill Clinton was up for re-election, there was a commercial that was run, and it was the face and voice of, a lot of us think of him as Moses, since passed away, Charlton Heston. And he looked into the camera, and he's speaking presumably to President Clinton, when he said, "Mr. President, when you say something that's wrong and you don't know that it's wrong, that's a mistake. But when you say something that's wrong and you know that it's wrong, that's a lie." That was what Charlton Heston said back in 1996. I reflect upon those words today, and I make this point that I know the truth. The American people need to know the truth. And that truth is the President of the United States can set the priorities on how to spend the $200 billion a month on average that come in revenue stream. All he has to do is step outside the Oval Office, step up to the microphones in the East Room, or outside in this nice, beautiful, warm summertime we have in Washington, D.C., and say, I'm going to set those priorities. If we can't make a deal with Speaker Boehner, who was just here on the floor, and with Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell and all the folks that have to vote in the Senate, and by the way, the people that have to vote here in the House, if we can't make a deal, here's what I'd do. The President could do this in next minute. I'm going to make sure our troops get paid first, on time, every time. He could say that. He could say, and right behind that $11 billion a month comes $20 billion a month out of the funding stream that we'll have whether we borrow or not. I'm going to guarantee that we service our debt, $20 billion. And then I want to make sure to take care of the national security issues. Those things will change, but I'll work those priorities, and right behind that we'll pay Social Security, and right behind that we'll pay Medicare. If the President stood up and said that, we would have confidence that he isn't going to be in the business of scaring seniors or putting doubt into the minds of our military while they are dodging bullets in places like Afghanistan. We would have confidence. But instead, he says he can't guarantee. Mr. Speaker, we know he can. We know he can guarantee. We should push that on him out of this House to let him know where we stand so the American people understand there is a moral standard here. One is tell the truth. The second moral standard is pay our military. The second moral standard is guarantee the full faith and credit of the United States government. I've laid out the rest of these priorities, Mr. Speaker, and cut, cap, and balance is an important position to stand on. This leverage that's here now must be used or we shirk our responsibility. Had the leverage been stronger back in 1995, that extra vote in the Senate that I spoke about some minutes ago would have been there, I believe. And I believe the balanced budget amendment would have been sent to the states, and I believe the states would have ratified it. And if that had been part of the Constitution the day I came here in January of 2003, I wouldn't have had to walk around on this floor and go find the chairman of the Budget Committee and say, where's our balanced budget? And I wouldn't have gotten the answer back that I did get that day, we can't balance the budget, it's too hard. Well, if it was too hard in January of 2003, how hard is it now? It is a lot harder. Yes, we can balance the budget. The states do that. And the question becomes, we send a balanced budget amendment to the states, do they ratify it? A lot of them would right away. Some of them would hold a special session to ratify a balanced budget to send that message as quickly as possible. But then you get out there to some of those states that have decided that they want to do irresponsible spending. California and Illinois come to mind. A lot of states went to austerity. They decided we're going to borrow money and we're going to ask the federal government to bail us out. In those states, if they're needed for ratification, there will have to be a changing of the political guard within their state legislatures. That means constitutional conservatives will step up, step out of their normal walk of life, advance themselves as candidates to run for state legislatures on the agenda of, I will go there and I will push to balance, to ratify a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget. Those candidates that stand on that position will be elected in significant numbers in the states where they're needed. And over a period of time, we have a chance that the state legislatures would ratify, three-quarters of them, ratify a balanced budget amendment. If that happens, it would be a wonderful gift for our posterity. It would be one of the best things that we could do in a generation, Mr. Speaker, and I urge that the American people weigh in on this and demand that the Senate and the President embrace cut, cap, and balance. With that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back.
Oh, wait. Oh, I didn't see Louis.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomert, is recognized for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A lot of things going on right now. One of them should be the business of the country. This body, this week, passed what many have said was truly historical. A truly historic bill passed the House of Representatives. It was not exactly what I wanted. I thought there was too much in it in the way of debt ceiling increase. I thought there was not enough in the way of budget cuts. But what we found in the cut, cap, and balance bill was that it included a provision that before the debt ceiling would ever be increased again, we would have to have a constitutional amendment pass the House of Representatives with 2/3 and pass the Senate with 2/3, which would not send it to the President for him to veto, as apparently he wants to do, but it would send it to the states directly. There's no provision for the President to sign a constitutional amendment after it passes the House and Senate with 2/3 of the vote. It goes to the states. If 3/4 ratify it, it's a part of the Constitution. But in order to get the debt ceiling raised, we would have to have a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution pass the 2/3 in the House and Senate. That seemed like an appropriate thing to do because, as many of us have said, the only way we're voting for a debt ceiling increase is if there is a real game changer as part of that we can't get any other way that will set this country on the course to being fully fiscally responsible. One of the reasons so many of us on both sides of the aisle ran for Congress was to come try to make sure that the liberties and the opportunities that we've had growing up would be available to future generations. The only reason that I was born in the greatest country in the history of mankind was because prior generations did smart things, did things that the Bible would say are blessed things. They did things that caused future generations to be blessed. It wasn't because I deserved it. I'd done nothing in my mother's womb to deserve to have the liberties and opportunities I had, but it was because prior generations sacrificed. So many laid down their lives so that we would have these opportunities. So we have an open process. It's supposed to be. We've got people in the gallery, Mr. Speaker. We've got people that are free to come to the U.S. Capitol, because we're in the people's house right now. And there are people across Capitol Hill, members that have their televisions on. People don't come to the floor like they once did to listen to speeches here, because they can sit in the comfort of their own office and do other work and have C-SPAN on and listen. That's been going on for 30 years. And it's been a helpful thing. You can see what's going on the floor, not just around Capitol Hill, but all over the country. And most of us came here to try to make sure that those same opportunities are afforded others. There's a lot of different motivations, a lot of noble motivations for running for Congress. But I think most of us came here for that purpose. And we disagree on the way to do it, but it is shocking that there could be so much disagreement over the absolute historic, unwavering principle that any nation that continually spends more than it brings in to its government will cease to exist as a government. There's no historic element contrary to that. You can't find it. If a government keeps spending more than it brings in, it's going to cease to exist. The only question remains, when does that happen? Now, there are movements around the world to try to end the dollar being the world reserve currency. When that happens, the dollar is going to fall farther than it ever has, and it may not recover. That's why I think some countries want to see that happen. Probably why George Soros wants to see it happen. But we also are told that our rating of our indebtedness, our bonds, may be downgraded if we don't get our indebtedness under control. And it only makes sense that that would happen if we don't get our spending under control. It should be a no-brainer, but apparently that is a malady that exists here in Washington. Situation where there apparently are some folks, and under the rules of the House of Representatives, I certainly can't say that there's anybody in the House or Senate that has no brain. We know biologically you have to have a brain, but it is possible that you can have a brain and not use it fully. I don't know how you explain the vote that took place right through that door and down that hall in the end of the Senate today. I don't know how to explain that. It's not that the Senate today had too much work to get done, too many bills to take up, that they just didn't have time to try to save the country from ceasing to exist because it can't stop spending. So it wasn't because there's too many other bills to take up. They have no bill to deal with the financial issues of this country. There is no bill down there that is going to be brought to the floor that will save this country from its own government stupidity. Not according to the House rules that there's anybody stupid here in the House or Senate, but as a group, sometimes we do very stupid things, and I would submit that what is happening today, what has happened today from a historic standpoint, is a statement that although nobody, according to the House rules, in a body is stupid, a body can do a stupid thing. So, even though there are no other bills being brought to the Senate floor to take up and vote on today, even though there are bills that have been filed to take care of this very issue, there's a cut, cap, and balance bill in the Senate that has been filed to address this issue. Many have signed on to bills that will address these issues. They're down there, but they're not bringing them to the floor, so not an overwhelming amount of work to be done on the Senate floor today. So they bring up the cut, cap, and balance bill, not for debate. Why would anybody be afraid of debating a bill that so many believe could help us save the country for future generations? Why would you be afraid to bring that up? Well, if you don't want to talk about it, if you don't want to have a debate on the House or the Senate floor on some bill that so many believe will help us save the country for future generations, you make a procedural move called a motion to table. And that is what happened in the Senate today. What courage that took. It must have taken a lot of courage, and I'm not kidding about that. When you know that there are so many people in the Senate body who want to talk about a game changer, who want to talk about what they believe with all their heart could set us on a course to fiscal responsibility that could save the country for future generations. You know all those people want to talk about it. It takes a lot of courage to stand up and say, I move to table that bill. Now, I don't know what the motivation is that would cause someone to stand up and say, I move to table. I second that. I don't know. I don't know why you would move to table. I don't know the motivation. But I know it takes courage when right at half of the 100 people in the Senate want to take this bill up and talk about it and debate it. And maybe amend it because I would love to amend it. I'd love to knock down the $2.4 trillion in debt ceiling increase. I'd love to raise the amount of cuts. A number of things I'd like to tighten up in that bill. But it was the best bill we had available. But what a great idea. Bring it to the floor. Let's talk about it. Let's amend it. Let's get it done. And the thing is, when you're in the majority of the House or the Senate and you don't like a bill and you bring it to the floor on an open rule, you can amend it on the floor. You can have the debate on whether or not it ought to be amended. We just went through that, and we voted for and against a lot of different amendments this week, that many of which I didn't think we necessarily needed to vote on. But that's part of the process. Why would anyone in the Senate be afraid of having that process on the cut, cap, and balance bill? I don't get it. I know it took courage to move to table when you know that America, all the polls show America is concerned about its future. Poll after poll shows that American adults in around the 70% area believe that the next generation will not have the opportunities that our generation had. You know those feelings are out there in America, and you know that there's a group that want to change the way we do business in Washington, so we have to live within the amount of money that comes in and not spend more than that. You know that feeling's out. You know that this is a bill that could change the way we do business. Why would you want to even allow it to the Senate floor to talk about it? It took courage to move to table. And here are the courageous senators that voted to table, which means to prevent debate on the cut, cap, and balance bill in the Senate. It truly took courage for these people in the face of 60, 70, some have indicated 80, but 60, 70% of America wants us to get our financial house in order, and there's a bill that will mandate that we do that. It takes courage to prevent that bill from coming to the floor, not for a vote on the bill, but just to debate the bill, to talk about it in front of God and everybody on the Senate floor. It took courage. I don't know the motivation for all these people voting to prevent debate and prevent the bill from coming to the floor. I just know that these people had courage to prevent what the majority of the American people believe needs to be discussed and debated and voted on. And these are the senators with that courage to prevent what the majority of the American people wanted done. From Hawaii, Senator Akaka. From Montana, Senator Baucus. And from Alaska, and Senator Begich. From Colorado, Senator Bennett. From New Mexico, Senator Bingaman. From Connecticut, Senator Blumenthal. California, Senator Boxer. From Ohio, Senator Brown. Washington State, Senator Cantwell. From Maryland, Senator Cardin. From Delaware, Senator Carper. From Pennsylvania, Senator Casey. From North Dakota, Senator Conrad. From Delaware, Senator Coons. From Illinois, Senator Durbin. From California, Senator Feinstein. From Minnesota, Senator Franken. And again, these are the people who had the courage to say, we will not allow the debate on the floor of the Senate that might lead to a balanced budget amendment being passed. We're not going to allow that to come to the Senate floor. So let me go through the remainder of the senators. Senator Hagan from North Carolina. Senator Harkin from the state of Iowa. Senator Inouye from Hawaii. Senator Johnson from South Dakota. Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota. Senator Cole from Wisconsin. Senator Landrieu from Louisiana. Senator Lautenberg from New Jersey. Senator Leahy from Vermont. Senator Levin from Michigan. Senator Lieberman from Connecticut. Senator Manchin from West Virginia. Senator McCaskill from Missouri. Senator Menendez from New Jersey. Senator Merkley from Oregon. Senator Mikulski from Maryland. Senator Murray from Washington. And again, I attribute nothing but courage to these people for voting to prevent what a vast majority of American people want to have debated on the Senate floor. They were able to have the courage to say, we're not going to allow debate. We're not going to allow the chance that you might get this bill passed that could save America for future generations. Further courageous senators, Senator Nelson from Florida, Senator Nelson from Nebraska, Senator Pryor from Arkansas, Senator Reid from Rhode Island, Senator Reid from Nevada, Senator Rockefeller from West Virginia, Senator Sanders from Vermont, Senator Schumer from New York, Senator Shaheen from New Hampshire, Senator Stabenow from Michigan, Senator Tester from Montana, Senator Udall from Colorado, Senator Udall from New Mexico, Senator Warner from Virginia, Senator Webb from Virginia, Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island, and Senator Wyden from Oregon. took a lot of courage to take a stand and vote in the Senate that we will not allow debate on this floor over a balanced budget amendment. We're not going to allow it. Despite the vast majority of Americans knowing that we have to get our fiscal house in order, knowing that a balanced budget amendment would force this body and the Senate body to do just that, knowing that that would prevent the White House from ever demanding that we spend $3.8 trillion when we're only bringing in $2.1 or $2.2 trillion, knowing that it would force Congress and the government to live within its means, they had the courage to stand up and say, we're not going to allow that debate. We're not going to allow the risk that you might pass a bill that forces us to be fiscally responsible. It took a courageous stand, and they stood and took that stand. Now, to have the President of the United States stand before the American public and say, I can't guarantee that seniors will get their Social Security checks, just requires a little bit of research to find out that apparently the President, just like all of us in Congress, we rely on our staffs, we rely on those around us to get us information so that we can speak truthfully from the information we glean for ourselves. Our staff helps us gather. And that tells you, though, that whoever is helping the President is not giving him truthful, accurate information. Because the fact is, the President is the only person in this country who can guarantee that Social Security checks will go out just as the law requires. I can guarantee that the money is there and that they'll be good even if this Congress does nothing for 3 years, even if everything else falls apart. We can guarantee that the Social Security Trust Fund has right now $2.6 trillion in Treasury notes in the Social Security Trust Fund that can be converted to cash, that can only, by law, only be used for Social Security benefits and expenses. So, the only reason that I or anyone else here in the House could not absolutely 100% guarantee that seniors will get their Social Security checks is because there is one element that could prevent that on the 2nd or 3rd of August, and that's if the President or Timothy Geithner ordered that the checks would not go out, knowing, well, I don't know if the President knows, but he may not have been given the accurate information, but I know Timothy Geithner knows that there's $2.6 trillion in the Social Security Trust Fund, that in 1985 there was a shortfall, there was not enough cash to pay Social Security payments, and so they sold some of the Treasury notes to get cash to make sure all the Social Security checks were paid. 1985. Some were apparently concerned that that might not have been legal. So in 1996, a Republican majority in Congress passed a law that basically says, hey, if there's a shortfall some month, then since there are trillions of dollars in the Treasury notes in the Social Security Trust Fund, then the administration can sell those Treasury notes just enough to make up the shortfall and assure that Social Security checks will go out. They made that a matter of law so that the administration may do that. What I've been proposing that we should make as a part of a prioritization bill that we bring before the House and pass it, bring before the Senate, and these same courageous people probably table that too, but it would say not that Social Security is a group of bills with others that must be paid, because by law, Social Security is separate. By law, it is paid with Social Security payroll taxes, And by law, if there's not enough cash to do that some month, you may take the Treasury note, sell just enough to make up that shortfall. And since the United States bonds and Treasury notes are still about the most desirable financial bond note to be purchased in the world, especially when you look at the alternatives, Greece, Portugal, Spain, France, not a lot of good choices. So they're buying our notes, and they would. That would continue, at least until we quit paying our bills properly. But I think the law ought to be changed to say not may, but must, so that in the future, no president would ever have to go before could not ever go before the American public and say, I can't guarantee Social Security checks won't go out. Because he is the one person in America that is the only person in America, he and his Secretary of the Treasury, that can stop them from going out. And if we make that may a must or a shall, then he has no option. Then we can guarantee that Social Security checks will not be interrupted. Because then we would know that the President has no option. He cannot interrupt the money that's there from going to Social Security recipients. Has to go, or he violates the law. And that could be grounds. I mean, if he stepped in, heck, if he stepped in even now and said, look, the money's there in the trust fund, but I want to make a political issue out of this, and I need a crisis in order to do that, so I'm going to step in and prevent the Social Security checks from going out this month, there would have to be action taken against the President. That is just irresponsible. I think it's totally inappropriate for a President to scare our seniors. I also think it's totally inappropriate to scare our military, and that's why I've been pushing for months a bill to ensure that people in harm's way never have to have it cross their mind that their check may not go home to their families. They should never have to have that cross their mind, never have it be a thought. And I thought about that a month or so ago as I accompanied the body of one of our heroes from New York to Gladewater, Texas. The family, the military member should never have to worry that their check won't be there. If there is a shutdown, if the government is not decides, oh, we got money here, but we're not going to pay our bills, well, we ought to make sure that a number of things get done. We keep being told that, gee, what if we default? There is absolutely, unequivocally no reason we would default on our debt unless, for some strange reason, the President and the Treasury Secretary, or either or, decide that they want to create and instigate such a financial crisis that they get whatever they want. That's the only reason there'd be a default. As Steve Moore from the Wall Street Journal said yesterday, you know, there's nothing that magic about August 2nd. There is no way that the President or Tim Geithner would be insane enough not to pay what we owe as it comes due. I mean, it's one thing for Secretary Geithner not to pay his taxes for 4 years in a row. It's quite another to put a nation at risk by refusing to send out the payments for the debts as they come due for the U.S. And it should also be noted that there are hundreds of billions of dollars that the United States owes to the United States. So if the United States doesn't pay itself, what are we going to do? Send out a notice that the United States didn't pay the United States, so we're deadbeats now? I mean, come on. There is so much political gamesmanship going on, and we were sent here to deal with the critical issues of this country. And being financially responsible is one of those things. Now, I doubt that very many people actually look at the back of their dollar bills, and I know they're having more and more trouble getting those dollar bills, but if you look at the back of the dollar bills, on either side, you see the two sides of the United States Great Seal that was adopted initially in the first version around the time of the Revolution. And the eagle has changed a little bit over the centuries, basically changed and basically this by 1790. Some people think that E pluribus unum, which is on the light fixture up here, pluribus unum, Latin meaning out of many, one, come from all over the world and come to America, we become one people. We speak one language, we become one people, E pluribus unum. Some think that's the national motto. It's not. It's part of the Great Seal and has been since the Revolution. E pluribus unum is on the ribbon that runs through the eagle's mouth. You've got 13 stars that cause us to remember the 13 original states. You've got a pyramid symbolizing this masterful, huge work. And above the pyramid is an eye in a triangle with a glow around it. The eye was put in the Great Seal back in the 1700s to symbolize the eye of God, the all-seeing eye of God. That's why there's the halo, the glow around it. And above those words in Latin are the words annuit coeptus. They're also above one of the doors in the Senate, so that every senator can look up, and if they know what the Latin means, they should be deeply touched and should be reminded of how important our job is, because annuit coeptus on the back of every dollar bill everywhere in America means this: He, God, has smiled on our undertaking. The reason that the Senate desired to have annuit coeptus above one of the doors is so senators would be reminded that at this country's inception, He, God, smiled on our undertaking. And I can't help but wonder today, as the all-seeing eye of God symbolized here looks at what is going on with our financial irresponsibility and our refusal to even debate becoming financially responsible in the Senate, if He, God, continues to smile on our undertaking. Some bank, for a joke at one time, had said, "In God we trust, all others we accept cash." But in God we trust is our national motto. And as I mentioned to Prime Minister Netanyahu as he came down the aisle before he took the podium here and spoke recently, I said, keep in mind the entire time you're addressing us, our national motto is above your head. He said, I'd already thought about that. Well, everybody in this body ought to think about it. Our trust is in God, but does He have any trust in us? After what has been done, spending so much more than the amount we've been entrusted with as stewards, we've got to do better. Mr. Speaker, how much time?
The gentleman has 1 minute remaining.
1 minute. To close, I want to finish with a short prayer that was prayed by the U.S. Senate chaplain in the 1940s, Peter Marshall. He prayed in the Senate in the 1940s, "May our prayer, O Christ, awaken all thy human reminiscences, that we may feel in our hearts the sympathizing Jesus. Thou hast walked this earthly vale and hast not forgotten